by the medium-range missiles from Europe, whereas the SS-20 cannot reach the United States. It is just affecting the Allies. So there's a total imbalance.
Do you understand the fear that people have for another increase in the number of nuclear arms?
Listen, young man, don't talk to me about fear of war. I've been in them. And let me tell you, as I've told you before, this group, it's a stupid way to do business. It's a folly, it's a waste. And nobody wants to go back to war. None of us. So all of us have that concern. But because we fear that there might be a war, doesn't mean we shouldn't take the steps necessary to keep there from being one.
All that which is claimed to defend us is going to destroy us, because those weapons which are now being placed in Europe will in fact, perhaps that's my fear, call for a preemptive or preventive strike by the Soviet Union, because they are threatened outside of their own borders very much. And I believe the Americans make it a little bit too easy, because they can very much shove the problem away and say, we can make surgical strikes. These weapons are made for small strikes, the surgical strikes, and thus you could try to limit war, which is, to me, insane.
Historically, we put nuclear weapons in Europe, the United States did, in order to deter a Soviet ground attack, and in a sense to compensate for what we considered to be the superiority in numbers of Soviet troops over NATO troops. But when the Soviet Union developed the capability to provide nuclear weapons in Europe, it negated the capability of our nuclear weapons to deter a war. It put us into a war-fighting situation.
Soviet people are just as much afraid of us as we are probably of them. And yet we in Germany have a historic and moral mission, I believe, because we have started too many wars, and we have also made much too much damage in the Soviet Union. 20 million people have died there because the Germans have started their war, have marched in. So we feel the mission must come from the people to start having another picture of these people, because every time we're confronted by the Soviet Union, we see women, men, and children. We do not see armies. And we do not believe, truly do not believe, that the Russians will march in here overnight. We don't believe it. And if they did, we know we have enough conventional weapons, enough air and sea-based systems already in NATO to confront any threat. This total overkill capacity is totally insane, and we must start somewhere to stop it.
These are pictures from a BBC film called The War Games, made in 1965 and banned from showing on television. Then almost all the press supported the official reason for the ban, but the film was too horrible to show. The unofficial truth is revealed in this letter by Lord Normanbrook, then chairman of the BBC Governors, who wrote that the war game on television might have a significant effect on public attitudes towards the policy of nuclear deterrence. For many years afterwards, the nuclear debate languished. But last year, the greatest peaceful gatherings of people since World War II took place in Europe and the United States. Last June, almost 1 million people transformed New York. 72% of all Americans, said a poll, wanted a halt to all nuclear arms building. Those who accused European campaigners of being anti-American would now have to level the same charge at millions of Americans who, said one newspaper, are reclaiming our American democracy. Paul Warmke was senior negotiator in the strategic arms limitation talks known as SALT. You're one of those who have sat down over a long period of time with the Russians negotiating. Could you give us a glimpse of how the Russian leadership thinks?
I would say that I see them as being very interested in controlling nuclear arms. Not because of any sort of philanthropy or anything of that sort, but because they are genuinely afraid of nuclear war. As a matter of fact, nuclear war to them is perhaps a more real threat and a more real danger than it is to us.
Why is that?
Well, for one thing, because of the fact that the last time there was military action on American territory was 120 years ago, and then it was Americans against Americans with muskets and cannonballs. Whereas the Soviets, of course, were major casualties of World War II.
Soviet overtures to us are invariably described as propaganda.
Yes.
How do we receive them? Are they
to be believed, or are they, most of them, propaganda? How do you see them?
Well, in my own opinion, what we have to do is to find out whether they're serious or not. If it's a bluff, we ought to call the bluff. It might very well turn out not to be a bluff. But if they make this kind of an overture, and we do nothing in response except to say that it's propaganda, it seems to me what we do is to sow division within the Western alliance.
How can arms control in the 1980s be put into practice, in your view?
Well, really, I see nothing wrong with the process that's been going on, except for the fact that it's taken an inordinately long period of time. SALT I froze the number of strategic launches. SALT II was designed to put an actual numerical ceiling, to begin reductions, and to begin the process of qualitative restrictions as well as quantitative restrictions. I say the only difficulty is that it's taken too long. Now, it's entirely feasible, entirely realistic, to say, okay, at this point, make a few cosmetic changes if you feel that you have to, so that you can call it SALT II.5, or the Reagan Treaty, and ratify it. And then move on, because once you've got that framework in place, then the opportunities are really vast. You could have, for example, a negotiation on theater nuclear force reductions. That could go on concurrently with negotiations on a bilateral basis between the United States and the Soviet Union to have further reductions, to extend the term of the treaty. By the end of 1981, the limit was supposed to be 2,250, which would require, as I've said earlier, that the Soviets eliminate some 250 to 300. Well, by the end of 1984, why not get down to 1,800? By the end of 1985, get down to something like 1,700 and extend the term of the treaty for another 5 years. You could have a negotiation of a ban on the flight testing of new missiles. We could proceed at the same time to complete the comprehensive test ban that would prevent any explosions of nuclear devices. At the present time, that just involves the United States, the Soviet Union, and England. But it could be expanded to bring in the French and the Chinese. And just in terms of proliferation, if the major nuclear powers could agree to a total stop of any nuclear explosions, that would, in my opinion, be the most powerful inhibition against anybody else getting into the nuclear weapons business. So that it's an entirely rational agenda. All we have is the question as to whether we have the political will to go ahead with it.
And does this U.S. administration genuinely want to negotiate?
I'm sure that there are some in the present administration that would genuinely like to see serious and effective arms control negotiations. There are, regrettably, others that think that it's a waste of time and that the only thing we can do with the Soviets is to outcompete them. And what they favor is what I've referred to as the arms race theory of arms control. That what we do is just go ahead as fast as we can with as much as we can in the expectation that they won't be able to keep up and that we'll get arms control by default. Well, I don't know of anybody who has been a serious student of the Soviet Union or of Russian history who believes that would take place. They would do whatever is necessary in order to match us, so that the race for strategic superiority is a recipe for disaster. We'll be bankrupt if we aren't obliterated. How many doctors are going to survive? How many urban hospital facilities are going to survive? What do you do with all the bodies? What are the epidemic consequences? What are the fallout consequences? The idea that you can fight, survive, and win a nuclear war is calamitous nonsense.
This arms race has gone on for a long time, and I think we need to slow it, stop it, and reverse it. And I think the time for that is right now.
People are beginning to ask questions about secrecy, about security, and beginning to feel that if we are a democracy, then we the people ought to be able to say what sort of defense policy we want.
When we set out to make this film almost 2 years ago, opponents of the nuclear arms race were still being dismissed as outside the popular consensus, as extreme or naive or even pro-Soviet.
Today, opinion polls show that a clear majority of the people of Britain are against cruise missiles on our soil. These are to be deployed throughout Western Europe this year, and we may have no control over them, and they may well undermine our last chance of avoiding a new and final stage in the nuclear arms race. But are governments listening to the common sense of their own people, or are they merely concerned with spreading new propaganda, as if wanting peace now is somehow unpatriotic? We were told we went to war in the Falklands over the issue of sovereignty. Is not surrendering control of missiles on our own soil also surrendering sovereignty? Even the so-called dual control is a propaganda term, designed to make the missiles more acceptable, but no safer. Certainly, more and more people are asking, impatiently and rationally, why over the years we have allowed this country to become a prime target, and more people, regardless of their political beliefs, are understanding that the Russians, like us, have every reason not to fight a nuclear war. You heard Paul Warnke, the American strategic arms negotiator, say that a rational agenda of disarmament was not only possible, but would work, and that to dismiss out of hand the overtures now coming from Moscow would only bring us even closer to war. In America recently, an historic motion to freeze the nuclear arms race was only narrowly defeated in the Congress. In spite of our own insidious propaganda and secrecy, we live in a democracy and the Russian people do not. Surely then, it is we who can and should take the initiative. Nuclear weapons were never an act of God. Nothing is inevitable.
Max Hastings.